Paswel Marenya is a senior scientist at the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMMYT. He's based in Nairobi, Kenya. He holds MSc and PhD degrees from Cornell University. His research is focused on maize-based smallholder systems in Eastern and Southern Africa, on the analysis of pathways and impacts of technology adoption within the framework of sustainable intensification. So it's my pleasure to welcome Paswel.
Thank you very much, Brent. I'm very honored to the University of Alberta, the Department of Agricultural Economics, Resource Economics. I can't get the full title, but I think if I say University of Alberta, that will cover it. To all the colleagues spread across the world, thank you. It's an honor to speak to you today. I hope my sound is good, Brent?
It's good.
Okay. Yep. So this section of the lecture will basically focus on what's going on in this part of the world as typified by Kenya. So if you forget about everything I'm going to say, try to remember the following. That before COVID, this part of the world already had, for lack of a better word, pre-existing conditions. Or, as I hear these days quite a bit, and as you hear also, comorbidities. So you have COVID on top of something else. So that being the case, it's a tragic situation, but it's also an opportunity to think carefully how to get out of this and perhaps once and for all, build a more resilient, more shock-proof economic and social system. So that's kind of the way I would like us to see this presentation, and so I'll go right onto it, and that's what I've just been saying. We'll try to see what the communities have been doing to cope, who are the most vulnerable, what is the government been trying to do, and what really does this all mean for this part of the world, but I dare say for all of us. Kenya in context, up in left top there is Africa, in the middle of the globe, and then Kenya is on the East African seaboard, surrounded by Ethiopia, Somalia, the Indian Ocean, Tanzania to the south, Uganda to the east, Ethiopia to the north. Most of the country is pretty much arid, even desert. The red and the orange that you can see, it's actually not suitable for agriculture. The green over here is suitable for agriculture. So the common statistic is that 20% of the country is the one that's actually suitable for agriculture. And this zone over here is actually the major population center for the country. This is sparsely populated, not unpopulated, but quite sparsely populated, but it's also the drier parts of the country. So coming to the pre-existing conditions, the unfortunate situation that I wanted to talk about is that even before COVID, a lot of people here in this part of the world, 7 out of 10 are informal jobs, daily wage jobs, self-employed, small business, micro business. It's a very agrarian economy. 6 out of 10 people are deriving their livelihoods from very unproductive agriculture, less than 2 tons per hectare of cereal yield, 56% of global average of major cereal yields here in Africa. Agriculture contributes 1/4 of the GDP, yet employs 2/3 of the population deriving direct and indirect livelihoods out of agriculture. So the more than 20%, 70% self-employed, small businesses include smallholder farmers, somebody selling food, somebody having a small shop somewhere selling some stuff. So that's kind of the picture you deal with. So what we're talking about here is essentially an economy that is low income, an economy that has pervasive poverty and malnutrition. By estimates late last year by the Brookings Institution and I think the World Bank, they estimated 420 Africans live on less than $1 a day. And the current economic growth is not enough to lift a substantial amount out of poverty. and 240 million in 2015 were estimated to be undernourished. And that percent is about 30 as per FAO estimate. So this is the sort of bleak situation, not to depress you, but to paint a picture of what we in the development field, in government, public sector, Brent has lived here for many years. This was his work, thinking of how to uplift these numbers to better numbers. So the most vulnerable people, therefore, live in this part of the world. I mean, if you think of any vulnerable person, it's the people I've just talked to you about, whether they are urban poor, day laborers, in artisanal jobs, rural landless, rural labor scarce. So you can say the majority of people in sub-Saharan Africa, as we speak, are exceedingly vulnerable to the situation, as we're going to see. So when COVID-19 showed up on our shows here, much to their credit, and as has happened in several African countries, the government came up very quickly. They didn't wait. There was ban on public gatherings, all the usual stuff that has happened with COVID-19 in order to flatten the COVID curve. One of the most important ones is that ban on gatherings and closing of food markets. But also the restricted movements and asking public sector workers and other office workers to stay at home, and closing of hotels and restaurants. You can see the generally depressed business atmosphere that has spawned. As if that is not enough, before COVID, there was locust invasion that has been concentrating the minds of the international community here for quite some time, and a new wave is expected to come. There are floods in the west of this country. 70,000 people have been displaced by the latest count. Lake Victoria has risen to a 56-year high, leading to serious floods in that part of the world. And of course, as if that was not enough, now we have COVID-19. So the immediate effects of all this is that nearly 70% of the people are eating less than they were before the whole thing started. If you look at that the middle number over there. And if you go to the left top, you see nearly 80% report somewhat facing increased food prices. Nearly 70% of women are out of work or have report either they are out of work or they have lost partially or totally their income. Many people get the feeling that their household expenditures have risen, and on the left top there, only 7%, less than 1 out of 10 people reported receiving any social safety net payment to cope with the economic situation. So this is just to continue. This kind of narrows down on Nairobi neighborhoods. 90% of people reduced incomes. 96%, even if they have something, they feel it's less than what they had, and 2/3 have had to cut on food expenditure. So it seems that there's going to be a serious economic contraction across the board. 1.5% by World Bank estimates. The United Nations, I don't remember which agency it was, said 1.8%. And so to narrow down to our sector, which is the agricultural markets, at 80% of the respondents or of the places that agricultural markets operate were either totally closed or only partially open. Only 1 in 5 markets were fully open. Again, this is because the government has had to do this. It's painful. It has impacted negatively on livelihoods, just as those numbers have been showing. But it is what is needed in order to curtail community transmission of coronavirus. And that's basically, we are repeating similar statistics. So the bottom line of all this is that, just as we've heard, that unfortunately COVID-19 is deadly when it comes on top of a pre-existing condition, or it comes on top of a comorbidity. So you can say that if that is true for individuals, that is also true for communities, and that's also true for nations. And that the situation is going to be hit very hard for places that were already grappling with fairly serious economic malnutrition and health vulnerabilities. So a survey that the Kenyan government just released the other day, phone survey, that's something that's being done quite, is showing those numbers. And we can talk about data. I have some thoughts about data as we conclude this talk. So given that, the influential African Development Bank had this to say. It said that given all these, the fallout from the economic problems that have come as a result of the need for social distancing, lockdowns, border problems, these things can cause more harm, more deaths, more loss of life than even coronavirus itself. In fact, as I talk, there is a serious border issue between Kenya and Tanzania, because they're trying to test all truck drivers coming in. They have closed the border for all non-commercial traffic, but that's creating a serious diplomatic issue. There are long delays at the border, long lines of trucks and all that. So this is not speculation. So this is happening right as we speak. So the responses have spanned the whole gamut of things, from community help, self-help. Those are limited, but there are those coming up. The government has about $80 million, they say, that they are trying to use as a cash transfer. They had said they have identified for now 250,000 households. Remember, Kenya is almost 48 million. By the latest census, there are about 12 million households in the country. So if you consider the levels of poverty and the number of people in the informal sector, you can see how many people need help. Far more than 250,000, millions of households, more than 10, and all you have is $80 million. Hopefully they will be able to mobilize more resources as time goes by. Okay, the government has had quite a number of fiscal and monetary responses, as the slide shows. But my thinking of all this is fine enough. Things like a moratorium on credit, or banks offering some 90-day repayment holiday. Those help a very small number of people who are in informal, fairly resilient jobs. So those kinds of benefits won't trickle down that quickly. But a good one is on the left bottom, tax-free bracket, which they raised from $102 to $240. So before, you began to pay, I think, about 10–15% tax at $102 a month. But now you don't have to pay tax until you hit 240. So I think that's quite a bit of a relief. I would say that's a winner. Much to their credit, the president has taken an 80% pay cut. So what can we look forward to in terms of building for a post-COVID-19 world in Kenya, in this part of the world? I have this in 3 segments: coping, recovery, and building resilience. So the slide I have in front of me is about coping. So in terms of coping, I see no way of getting out of this other than finding resources to expand the social safety nets, principally finding ways of giving households who have lost their income, who can cope, some cash, which they can also use, therefore, to stimulate local food markets and other markets. It would be important at this time to start thinking of how the full is probably not the right word to use in these circumstances, but how some kind of normal operations, and put normal in inverted commas, quotes, how that can happen. How can agricultural markets operate with physical distancing? Suggestions include decentralizing those markets, increasing the number of market days, having smaller markets in the neighborhoods instead of those large. Those of you who've been to Africa, the large, chaotic, rhythmic, colorful, but crowded markets. Maybe those not come back that quickly. So what can be done to sustain some operations in the medium, in the short term? In saying this, I think the use of public health science to guide all this process will be extremely critical. How can you do this in a way that will lead to an exponential explosion of COVID-19 infections? In the recovery phase, I think data systems will need to be put in place now as the recovery gathers pace, in order to have more effective action. The other element would be to support the private sector to come back. I don't see any other way other than thinking very, very carefully how to support businesses that have lost customers, that have lost income, that are on the brink of bankruptcy. What can be done to offer, I don't know, business loans, tax holidays, a raft of things that can help businesses get back on their feet as we begin to see how to recover. So that would be my 2 cents on the left and on the right there. Put in place data systems, which are woefully lacking at this moment. And then for the long term, I have 2 slides, is build resilience. And in this slide, I have 3 things that can help build resilience. Climate smart and agroecologically sensitive production systems must stop being just academic writings and conference discussions. This must now be part and parcel of agriculture going forward. But what I wanted to discuss even more is declaring war on the costs of food production and distribution, bring technologies to reduce cost of production, reduce post-harvest losses from 30%, which is what is typically measured, to, in my view, less than 5%, and then remove any inefficiencies in food distribution. Why do I say this? Because you are not going to build a resilient economy with low incomes and expensive food. Look at the statistics at the bottom right there, that 45% of incomes in Kenya, according to the World Bank, is spent on food. So imagine if you can reduce the cost of food using the bullets above to a half of that, or 2/3 of that. It's doable if those elements are brought on board. What that does is that it raises incomes of low-income people. It encourages savings. The other items on this should be, of course, diverse safety net programs, not just cash transfers. Much like Sven was talking about, Canada has a lot of different types of safety net programs. This is the time to start thinking about that here as well. Of course, with the caveat that these are low-income economies. But that means, bottom of my slide, now is the time to think of building economic growth that is broadly shared, making financial products or inclusion part of that, and encouraging savings. Encouraging savings will need what I've just described in terms of bringing the cost of food down. But very importantly, to the right top, investments in human capital, access to health and education. So that's long term. I don't see how you're going to build a resilient economy without these types of investments. So my parting shot for all this is that resilience of our health, social, political, economic, and market systems should be seen as an end in itself. It should be seen as a goal in its own right. As we have seen now with COVID-19, if we have an economy with vulnerabilities, if we have our fellow citizens in this country, in any other part of the world who are suffering vulnerabilities, those vulnerabilities are shared. So it is in our own interest, all of us, to ensure that we can create societies, economies that are resilient and where everybody can survive or has at least a fighting chance to survive these kinds of shocks. I apologize if I sound a bit emotive about that, but that's what I wanted to share with you today. And I do hope that as time goes by, if you go to the course contacts, you can reach out, we can have a chat, We can talk about how to put a good communications agenda, think pieces, and share thoughts with like-minded colleagues all over the world. Thank you very much.